Hey West Jones, I'm Daria Wilson with the Mustang Network. Today you're watching the brand new student-led podcast Horseplay. Catch us on Apple Podcasts and YouTube. From West Jones to the world.
My name is Alex Hinton. Today we'll be discussing Is Water Wet? This is Van Albert, Madison Cooley, and Bryson Ezel. We chose this topic because it's a very popular topic to talk about, and we are all very passionate about it. There's plenty of discussion surrounding it. So, what are y'all opinions on Is Water Wet?
Water's not wet.
I mean, it depends on the state that it's in, because gas isn't wet, but water is.
So what would y'all's definitions with wet be? What do you think is wet?
Well, wet is like it makes. Why did you word that like that? Well, the origin of wet relates to water, so.
So water.
So
Water
water,
is wet.
it's like what you have to think about. Like water comes in more than one form, so you can't say that water itself is wet in every form. You can only say that it's wet in the water state and possibly the ice state.
So why can't it only be wet in one state but not other states?
Because gas.
Yeah, gas can't be wet. So, why do you think water can't be wet?
I'm just thinking as a liquid.
Thinking of a liquid, so why can't a liquid be wet?
Well, I googled the definition.
What's that definition?
What did Google tell you? 'Cause
It said it applies to solids.
Only solids. Well, that's funny because my definition I googled says wetness is a state of being covered or saturated by a liquid, like say a towel that's saturated by. So that's wet.
Well, mine was scientific.
Okay, but you can't really trust Google. Google is not a reliable source.
Exactly.
You should.
And mine is the Oxford Dictionary. That's more trustworthy than some random guy named Glick.
How do you know his name is Glick?
You told me beforehand.
But Glick is a scientist.
So, okay, let's clear up the definition we're using. Are we going to use yours or mine?
It doesn't matter. Doesn't yours require a surface though?
Well, whatever definition you use changes the way that you're looking at it, because your definition applies to you and his definition applies to his stance.
So let's discuss which definition is right.
Okay.
My definition would state that water, so you can't put water on water, right? It'll just merge into one solid body. Not solid, liquid body. But if you were to say, get onto the molecular level, water really is covered by other molecules of water. Really get into it. What did you guys say to that?
Water wet.
My entire argument is that if I was to dump a bottle of water on our good pal here, that water makes things wet, so it has to be wet to make things wet.
But if it's wet, it also can be dry.
A single molecule of water is not covered by other molecules of water. It'll be dry.
But it's not liquid. Is it?
That's a good point. Would it be liquid?
Well, I mean, when you think about other things that are wet, they make other things wet. Water makes other things wet.
If you had a single molecule, it'd be a gas, wouldn't it?
I don't know.
So I'm starting to lean towards the water is not wet side.
Oh, you're having
That's pretty.
crisis.
That's a pretty convincing argument right there.
Because if water's wet, then it has to be dry, and water can't be dry, is what Pam said. So I kind of lean towards water's not wet now.
Yeah. So it seems like we're going to reach a conclusion. What was your definition of water?
What?
I mean, wet.
Or something that applies to solids.
Only solids. But why can't an oil be on top of, say, water, and that oil make that water wet?
I mean, I guess that could work through your definition.
But why can't it work through yours?
I don't know.
So
you Googled a definition and have nothing to back it up, is what you're saying?
I guess.
So your definition is just wrong.
I mean, go by your definition.
So by my definition, it has to be covered, right? So we can't use your definition anymore because it's wrong.
Okay.
So water. Well, okay. I read somewhere that if you have 6 or less molecules of water, it doesn't behave like water. Wait, then it'd be like solid or gas then.
This is a train wreck because y'all's opinion is changing in the middle of this conversation,
Wow.
and y'all debated this for 2 days that it was.
I don't know what changed.
Did y'all plan to have
So
a
it
midlife
sounds-
crisis?
It sounds like, depending on the definition you choose, water is not wet, or
Well,
water
even-
is wet.
Even by the definition I chose, it still wouldn't be wet.
If you're choosing,
Okay,
if you're
why?
saying if something has
Because
to be
if you have a
covered,
single molecule of water, that's a gas.
Yeah.
It's not solid or liquid.
Well,
And
technically,
we're talking about the liquid
gas
state of
is
water,
still
right?
More, yeah, liquid state.
So a single molecule of water would really be a gas. Because think about what the air
Okay, but
is.
why are we talking? When did we go to one singular molecule of water? We were
Because that's the only possible way for water to be wet.
so something
You can't, because by my definition, it has to be covered, right?
right.
Water would cover water in a liquid form. But water can't have a surface. Like a body of water cannot have a surface, except for the one on top. And you can't cover that surface with more water. It'll just be absorbed into the
I
other
think y'all are thinking
state.
too hard. I think y'all are thinking.
So why do you think water is wet?
I think that if something has the ability to make something wet, then it itself is wet. Because if I had a soaking wet towel and I smacked you in the face with it and now your face is wet, if I had a bottle of water and I poured it and now he's covered in water and he's wet.
These are very violent actions.
But the towel isn't what's making it wet.
The water in the towel is what made you wet.
So the water made the towel wet.
And then the water in the towel still made you wet.
So
the water itself.
so you need a towel to act as like a medium.
Okay, you go wash your hands. Your hands are wet. How did they get wet? From water.
So how can
So
water
water
make
has-
itself wet?
I think you're thinking more of like it itself is not making itself wet. It itself is wetness.
So water is like
So by that definition, water would be wetness. So oil would be wetness.
Yeah, I mean, my hands would still be wet if it was covered in oil. It would be oily, but it would still be wet. It wouldn't be dry.
I agree.
You're thinking more on the molecular level instead of wet or dry.
A general level? Well, the problem with the general level is that
Okay, but most people don't think
Wait.
on a molecular level.
what's your definition of wet?
That word? Like, what do you mean definition of it? I
Like-
think the definition of wet is wetness.
How would you define something as being wet?
As being wet?
Like what separates dry hand from wet hand?
It's got water on it. It's got something on it. That's like,
So then what's
It's got
on
something liquid.
yeah, something liquidy on it. See, that's a very
So
difficult
liquid-
to describe.
So liquid is technically covered by the water, so water would be wet.
Yeah.
But how? But then
Because you have to not think on it on the molecular level, or you start getting confused. But I'm like, if you go and you put your hand under a faucet, your hand is not dry now. If you have the water running, your hand's not dry.
So what I'm getting is water is wet because it produces wetness
Yeah.
onto something.
Yeah.
but how's it wet itself?
Because that's just how it's made.
Because it makes things wet. Would you consider like a soda wet? If you got poured soda on your hand and now your hand is wet from soda, would you consider the soda itself wet?
No. I mean, I see what you're getting at. It has to be wet to get other things wet.
No.
But then again, why?
Because that's the rules of nature, I guess. I'm not thinking on the molecular level, because when you think on the molecular level, is anything actually what it is?
So let's just stay on the
Fair
general.
point. So yeah, let's take a cup of water as the
Mhm.
example. So that water's wet.
That water's wet, the cup is wet. If you put your hand in the cup, your hand is now wet.
So anything that can. So water is wet because it can make other things wet.
Yeah.
I think that's our conclusion right there.
I mean,
So,
what was it, 60% of the school agrees with us? Or
But
that it is?
60% of the school says water.
Okay, but
we did a poll
40%
and
isn't.
60% goes with water is wet,
Yeah.
and 40% says water is not wet.
But the population, 53%, agree with water's not wet.
okay, but We weren't asking the population.
The school is
Our
actually
specific
very smart.
study says 60%. So we're gonna get Hart to go talk to people and get their conclusion on it, and we're gonna try and get a couple of, at least
Actual-
one teacher scientific opinion on it. But I think that 100%, if it makes something wet, then it itself is wet.
Because if it's not wet, how does it make things wet if it's not wet?
But it's fire burning.
Yes.
Is fire burn? Interesting question. The reason I can't compare it to is water wet is because fire is a chemical reaction. Water, that's not a chemical reaction. It is a compound.
Yeah, that's true.
So
If fire is burning, it's a separate conversation.
Yeah, it's a really
Yeah.
different conversation.
you could say it is, but it doesn't. It can't really relate to
that's
is
more
water
of-
wet.
A reaction.
So you've run out of defenses.
Not necessarily.
I just
What
find it
else?
funny how y'all had a midlife crisis and then reversed your midlife crisis.
So what's your final defense?
I don't know.
You don't know? You're out of defenses then.
So
Like,
it
You
sounds
can't say you're
like-
not out of defenses and then say I don't know.
For something to be wet doesn't require two substances.
What?
Fair point. You'd require.
well, you got water and then you
You got water.
It's
You'd
just
require
water.
two
Water
gases.
is a liquid and substance in the case, but
Water can just be water and make things wet.
it can make itself.
Making
something-
something wet is the act.
So something can make itself wet. Anything can make itself wet.
I don't think so.
So
You don't think so?
I don't know.
Your mouth makes itself wet with saliva.
That's true.
Fair point. Different.
It's different.
It sounds-
It's
Your
still
mouth
like
is solid.
yeah.
Weren't you going to argue? Since technically no molecules are
Hey.
touching.
We're not talking about molecules anymore, though.
this is just a general.
I mean, you could still latch
Solids
to
can-
But yeah, I mean,
Solids
molecules
can-
don't touch.
Like
They're
ice
atoms
Ice is
touching.
wet.
Yeah,
Ice is wet.
Dry ice can be wet.
Dry ice can be wet.
Ice is
so solids can be wet.
Solids can be.
yeah, but liquid.
Solid
And
ice
liquids
can
Like
be.
if you put an ice cube on your hand and it starts melting, that's making your hand wet. So it can also make things wet.
Right.
So solids can make things wet.
Well, no, because the
Well,
solid
because it turns
produces
into
the
liquid.
liquid, which makes things wet.
Right.
But it's still making
But it's
something
still
wet.
producing
Only if you
something.
think about it in the sense that the solid is itself making your hand wet. Like, is the solid sitting in your hand, not melting, making your hand wet?
Have you ever rubbed a piece of ice on your skin
When you start moving,
before it melts?
like
That's
it starts
because
melting
it's
as soon as it's in a different environment, keeping it cold.
Do you know how skating works?
Have you reached your hand into an ice chest before?
Well, yes, that's because it melts on contact.
Exactly. So that's
It's
not
like-
a really fair
so the-
argument because no
it's-
matter what you put it in, it's going to
It's
immediately.
The liquid water from the ice making
Right.
your hand wet.
Which just
If
further
you're-
supports solids can make
Right.
you make things wet.
Right.
I disagree with that.
Are you having another midlife crisis?
No.
Okay.
I'm just saying, like, solids can't make things wet
I think
because it's the liquid produced by the solid. that's
Right.
making
But I
Yeah,
it
but
mean,
the solid is
but
the
the
solid
ice
is
itself
the
is
reason
the-
for it making it wet is because
Right.
of the solid. Without
Right.
the solid, it wouldn't be wet.
right.
The solid is producing the liquid, and the liquid makes you wet. So the solid does not make you wet.
But the liquid still does.
The
I
liquid
guess it-
from the solid, the liquid that makes the solid,
It
makes the
and
makes
by
it
that
wet.
reasoning,
It
ice
doesn't
is
make
still
you wet by association, I guess.
But it still makes you wet, even by association.
By association, it makes you wet, not by like literal.
Which still makes you makes it
would
still
this,
proves the
would
point.
this ice cube sitting in my hand make me wet?
Yeah.
Okay, so pretend I have a metal table. Put an ice cube on it. The metal table is really cold, so the ice isn't melting while it's on top of that metal table. Is that ice cube making the table wet by sitting on top of it?
It wouldn't.
I feel like it definitely would, because even though the metal table is going to be cold, unless you drop that table down to below freezing temperatures, it's still going to melt the ice cube.
Well, I mean, yeah, like
It's gonna change shape.
Right. It's
cold,
still
en-
gonna-
cold enough so that the ice won't melt. Like pretty much just take it out the refrigerator or freezer, and then just set.
I think that it would still melt on the table because the table itself is going to still be
Okay,
cooling. It's going to be heating up. The ice is going to be heating up. It's still going to melt.
so question: how does this relate to is water wet?
Because I brought in the ice,
Yeah.
and that's a solid.
So water can get water wet if you define water as being anything made of H2O, because water can get ice wet.
Right.
So by
So we
that
all agree
definition,
to that, right?
Mm-hmm.
But there's a reason if liquid water is called water, and then ice is called ice,
Right.
and then it's called steam. It's entirely different things. It's
Well,
all
yeah,
H2O, but it's entirely
Ice
different
can still
things.
make you wet because it melts. That was my whole point. Here.
I think we've just about discussed it enough. I think we should all talk about like our final stances on this. Well, what's your final stance?
That it is wet when you're in reference to liquid.
What's your final stance?
I still think it's not wet.
What's your final stance?
I think water is wet.
And my final stance is that water is not wet. Changed my opinion. Like, to be totally honest here, not wet. So we've done the poll. We've got a general idea of what everyone thinks. But we're going to introduce Hart Bensley doing Heart in the Hallway. He's going to be walking around campus with a camera, interviewing students like you in the cafeteria, hallways, and Madison Cooley over here is going to be interviewing Mr. Nakis later.
Heart in the hallway.
Turn me up, YC.
What's up, West Jones? It's Hart Bensley with Heart in the Hallway on Horseplay on the Mustang Network. Today, we're going to be going into the school and asking students about these questions we've been discussing on the podcast. So, do you think water is wet?
Yes.
Why?
Because it just is. Like, it has to be wet to make something wet. So it's wet.
What about you?
Yeah, I think it's wet. Same reason.
Okay. Is water wet?
I guess so.
How come?
It's water.
Okay. Is water wet?
No.
What's your reasoning behind this?
It just makes things wet. I don't feel like water is wet. I feel like it just makes things wet. Yeah.
Interesting. Let's go find some more people to interview. All right, here come some people. Good gentlemen, what are you guys' names?
Cam Tony.
Cooper Kennedy.
Chase Todd.
So, here's the question. Is water wet?
Yeah.
I think it's whatever you want it to be.
I see.
Yes.
So, is water wet?
Yeah.
How come?
Well, it's water.
I see. What's your name?
David Valentine.
And in your opinion, is water wet?
Water is wet, yes.
How come?
I don't know why, but it is.
It's just part of nature?
Part of nature.
All right. What is your name?
Autry.
And do you think water is wet?
No.
Why?
I don't know. It's not.
Okay. Why?
Just because, like.
Is water wet?
Very wet.
How come?
It makes other things wet. I think it's wet.
Believable. What's your name?
Jacase.
Quick answer. What is... they're too fast. What is your name?
Cherokee.
And in your opinion, is water wet?
Yes, very.
How come?
Because it's just like that.
Okay. Is water wet?
Yeah.
Okay.
Hi guys, I'm here with Miss Danakis and we're going to get her opinion on if water is wet.
Well, Madison, the definition of wet means covered with water or covered with another liquid.
Right.
So, no, water's not wet because it is the thing that does the covering, of course.
Right.
The other definition of wet is feeble or shows lack of character or strength. And we all know that water is not feeble. The lowly water molecule has hydrogen bonding. It exhibits hydrogen bonding because it has two covalent bonds and then it has two lone pairs on top, which means it's awesome, it's strong, it has very strong intermolecular forces. So all chemistry students know that water is not feeble. So no matter how you define it, water is not wet. That is my personal opinion, and I think that's the opinion of most chemists.
Well, you heard it here first, and after talking to Ms. Danakis, my opinion myself has changed a little bit. So there you have it.
Thanks for tuning in to Horseplay on the Mustang Network. Be on the lookout for our next episode as West Jones students Chase Todd, Cooper Kennedy, Hart Bensley, and Cam Tony answer the question, was Thanos right? But for now, remember kids, water is not wet.